Hey everybody, I hope you're doing good. Let me get my phone into my pocket here. I'm sorry for the noise. I know that's an annoying sound. Anyway, I'm reading now a chapter or the third chapter of Varieties of Marxist Humanism, Philosophical Revision in Postwar Eastern Europe by James E. Satterwhite. Chapter 3 is titled Czechoslovakia, the Philosophical Background of the Prague Spring. First section, the historical setting. The year 1956 was of particular importance in Czechoslovakia, as it was in all the countries of Eastern Europe. Stalin had died 3 years earlier, and in 1956, Khrushchev came out as at the 20th Soviet Party Congress with his denunciations of Stalin and Stalinism. This had the effect of giving further momentum to a trend that had begun in part at the death of Stalin, that of disorientation and of the questioning of basic assumptions about life. Khrushchev's speeches sent a shockwave rippling throughout Eastern Europe, undermining the trust of many people in what they had been led to believe about the world. Compared with the way it registered in Poland or Hungary, this shock was less immediately felt or seen in Czechoslovakia, but even there, it eroded the foundations of the Stalinist order. This erosion first revealed itself in the questioning that arose in regard to many of the manifestations of the Stalinist era. This erosion of the most basically believed values was accompanied by an undercurrent of searching for new, more authentic values. In Czechoslovakia, this search was not manifested outwardly as it was in Poland or Hungary, but begun quietly. It took the form of a desire to gain more flexibility in everyday endeavors. This meant less control by the party over the details of everyday work and over the first tentative attempts to redefine social life. The search was of necessity cautious because the party still retained firm control in Czechoslovakia and was anxious not to participate in the, quote, de-Stalinization campaign any more than it had to, lest it destroy its own authority in the process. The party resisted any and all questioning of its position and was extremely reluctant to give up any part of its prerogatives in any sphere. In fact, the reaction to the events of 1956 in Hungary and Poland was to make party leaders in Czechoslovakia still more resistant to change and less inclined to implement any new policies related to the de-Stalinization process set off by Khrushchev's speeches. The Czech Communist Party newspaper, Rude Pravo, even ran an editorial on January 29, 1957, saying that, quote, the ambiguous word, quote, de-Stalinization stands only for the idea of weakening and giving way to the forces of reaction, end quote. Cited in Z. Brzezinski's The Soviet Bloc, published in 1960. In November 1957, Antonin Novotny, who had been head of the party since 1953, assumed the post of president as well, thus further consolidating power and resistance to change within the party. Nonetheless, the shockwave had done its damage, and the questioning process that had begun could not be halted. The years 1956 to 1968 witnessed a revival of creative activity in all spheres of life in Czechoslovakia, most notably in the sphere of art and culture. Art was breaking away from the hitherto prevailing theory of, quote, socialist realism, in which it was expected to serve an edifying function, and was beginning to explore new modes of creativity. The guidelines of, quote, socialist realism were being more and more loosely interpreted under pressure from artists who, uncomfortable with the strict style that had been required of them, wanted to be free to create as they chose. Part of this discontent focused on the demand made by socialist realism that art play a socially edifying role in building up the character of the new socialist man and in furthering the progress of socialist society. As early as 1956 and 1957, a series of debates on philosophy and culture took place in the newspaper Literarny Noviny. Two philosophers, Karl Kozik and Ivan Svitak, played a prominent role in these debates. I have pieces by both of those authors on this channel. The articles, which attracted a good deal of public attention, were instrumental in raising public awareness of some of the questions being asked in intellectual circles and in bringing some of the issues of the day out into the open. At the Second Congress of Czechoslovak Writers in April 1956, voices were already heard protesting the Stalinist cultural policies in Czechoslovakia. The event that most undermined belief in the Communist Party and in the system as a whole, as it was then constituted, was the series of revelations in 1963 that the Slansky trials were not what they had been represented to be. So here. Come on. Oh shit! That source that I read earlier. That source I mentioned earlier was from the wrong book. The source that I meant to say earlier when I was talking about Brzezinski was actually Tad Julk in a book Czechoslovakia Since World War II, published in 1972. And then that most recent citation, footnote, Vladimir M. Kusin, The Intellectual Origins of the Prague Spring. And footnote, in the legal profession, these revelations about the trials prompted a rethinking of the problem of the nature and role of law in a socialist society. Whereas demands were heard from the philosophers for more room in which to carry on their activity. One commentator has said that, quote, 1963 was the most important year in Czechoslovakia between 1948 and 1968. 1963 was a year in which all the political, ideological, intellectual, and economic problems suddenly escalated and escaped the control of Novotny's regime. End quote. Tad Julk, Czechoslovakia Since World War II. The first open challenge to the Novotny regime came from the Congress of Slovak Writers Union, the Slovak Writers Union in Bratislava on April 22, 1963. This challenge resulted partly from the fact that the Slovaks had suffered disproportionately under Stalinism because their desire for more autonomy was labeled, quote, bourgeois nationalism, end quote. Their reaction, quote, took the form of a revival of Slovak nationalism and protest against the vestiges of Stalinism still alive in Czechoslovakia. End quote. Tad Julk. The challenge continued at the May 22nd meeting of the Czechoslovak Writers Union, at which time the delegates in a sense picked up where they had left off in 1956. the Slovak poet Lako Novomesky, who had been denounced along with Gustav Huzak as a nationalist in 1950, spoke at both the Bratislava and Prague conferences. In Prague, he gave a speech in which he said that the, quote, tragedy of the whole situation was, ... that we misled and confused a whole generation, ... To this generation we must return confidence, trust, and truth. However, we must find them in ourselves first, end quote. As cited in Julk. On May 27th and 28th, the Congress of the Slovak Journalist Union, meeting in Bratislava, further challenged the party on its cultural policy. The Czechoslovak Writers' Union was to play a crucial role in the reform efforts again a few years later at its meeting in June 1967. At the same time, the increasing number of challenges were heard in the realm of culture. Another important development was taking place in the sphere of economics. Quote, from the late 50s, the increasingly disastrous state of the economy, ... which culminated in an unprecedented crisis in 1963, had given rise to decentralizing proposals. These ideas, following Soviet leads, culminated in the elaboration of the new economic system, or model, by a team led by Professor Ota Zik, that's actually how I say it, Ota Zik. The system was accepted officially in 1965 and introduced at the beginning of 1967, ... What was important about the introduction of the new economic system, ... was that it made an ideological and practical breach in the wall of Novotny's neo-Stalinist model. End quote. A. Oxley et al. In the volume Czechoslovakia, the Party and the People, published in 1973. The efforts to bring about change in Czechoslovakia were successful, though only for a brief period, because the crises in the economic and cultural spheres converged with a political crisis within the party. What happened in 1968 was new only in the way in which it brought together ideas that had already been developed in the preceding years. Still, the process of rethinking was very gradual and was accompanied only in stages through the period after 1956. New section, the philosophical critique. During these years, as more and more people became involved in the process of rethinking, it became clear that philosophy had a major role to play in providing a coherent expression for the often inchoate strivings in all areas of society, especially in the artistic and cultural sphere. The task of giving theoretical expression to this revival of creativity in art and culture was aided by the emergence of a new understanding within Marxist philosophy of man and his creative role in the world. An understanding that was exceptionally well represented by the philosophers Kozik and Zvitak. Kozik and Zvitak's tasks were different, but they complemented one another. Kozik began with a study of the Czech radical Democrats of the 19th century and attempted to find in them a clue to understanding something of the nature of Czech culture. Kozik then went on to draw on virtually all modern currents of philosophy in an attempt to create a synthesis and a new understanding based on this synthesis. This work came out in 1963, entitled Dialectica Concretneho, The Dialectics of the Concrete. Drawing on several papers Kozik had presented at various philosophical conferences through the preceding years, this work was of great significance, drawing as it did on the different currents of philosophical thought, but transforming them into something genuinely new, something that was authentically Marxist as well. In the book, Dialectics of the Concrete, Kozik followed the patterns set by all serious West European Marxist scholars, as well as by those in East Europe, who were committed to a serious study of Marx as opposed to mere apologetics. This thinking drew on the main currents of European thought, such as existentialism and phenomenology. In addition, Kozik, like any of the above type of thinker, could not have failed to take into account the writings of Georg Lukács as part of the intellectual heritage of 20th century Marxism. He most certainly would have been familiar with the work of those of his contemporaries in the field worthy of note, either from Eastern Europe or the West. This stance is in particular contrast to the approach taken by Soviet Marxist scholars and those connected with the more orthodox view in East Europe. These scholars were characterized by the refusal to come to terms with other philosophical currents in any serious or open fashion. Existentialism and phenomenology were of particular significance to Kozik because of the way they center on man and his activity. Kozik was important in systematically providing a theoretical foundation for this new understanding of man, whereas Svitak's contribution lay in building on this foundation with his interest in a philosophy of aesthetics and culture. His major book in this regard was Lidsky Zmysł Kultury, The Human Meaning of Culture. The Human Meaning of Culture, a series of essays written over the years from the early 1950s to 1968, dealing with the problematics of philosophy and art. Ivan Svitak is of particular importance in the revival of culture and the arts in Czechoslovakia after 1956 because of the way in which Svitak, as a philosopher of culture, applied the new understanding of man and his creative activity, which was then appearing in East European Marxist thought, in his essays on art and aesthetics. By dealing with art and culture directly in his writing, he helped to formulate a new theory of the role of art as well, based on the concept of man's creative activity in the world, or praxis. Svitak's particular genius lay in the way he managed to interpret the new philosophical concepts for the realm of culture, but this was not his activity per se. He is a philosopher of culture and as such deals with culture and art, looking at works of art for their significance and meaning in terms of their portrayal and understanding of man and his world, and of man in the world. Svitak's essays were quite controversial, and his own career reflects this reaction. He was a member of the Institute of Philosophy in Prague, where Svitak's lectures and writings were banned as early as 1955. Almost all of Svitak's subsequent writings were originally lectures that either were not allowed into print or were confiscated as soon as they appeared in print. The years 1955 through 1964 saw himself suspended from and then reappointed to the Institute 3 times. He still managed to contribute to a wide variety of conferences, including one in Dubrovnik, Yugoslavia in 1963 on, quote, Man Today, end quote. In fact, 1963 was a particularly good year for Svitak in this regard, as in addition to the above, he participated in the Conference on the Theory of Literature at Tbilisi and another held there devoted to the works of Franz Kafka, which was an event having far-reaching repercussions on Czechoslovak cultural life. In 1964, Svitak was expelled from the Institute and from the party, though the Institute's party organization itself refused to fire him, as did the next higher level in the party hierarchy. Nevertheless, in 1966, he was able to lecture at Charles University in Prague as part of a series of lectures on, quote, philosophical anthropology, though the course was banned by the dean of the philosophic faculty before its end. It was during 1968, however, that Svitak came into his own again. His essays and lectures were published in book form, and he took an active part in public discussions in various newspapers over the course of that year. He had prepared another book entitled Hlavu proti zdi, Head Against the Wall, when the invasion prevented its publication. Footnote, it was subsequently published in the United States as the Czechoslovakia Experiment, 1968 to 1969. This is a collection of some of Svitak's newspaper articles and essays, including one titled The Genius and the Apparatus, which appeared in his book Man and His World, A Marxian View. Both Kozik and Svitak took an active part in public debate. In the case of Kozik, he entered this debate at the time of the Fourth Congress of the Union of Czechoslovak Writers in 1967. By 1968, both were active. The significance of all this philosophical activity was that it put into words and gave a theoretical base to the new direction in art and culture. Artists had been straining against the leash that the concept of socialist realism had become for them. Although the artist's activities cannot be viewed as dependent on or even as springing from the new philosophical understanding of man, this philosophy came at the right moment for them. In a certain sense, art and philosophy were developing in a parallel fashion, but with a difference. In addition to straining in its own area against the same limits that art encountered in its field, philosophy was by its very nature given the additional task of formulating and expressing the problem theoretically. Kozik himself alludes to this fact when discussing the nature and role of philosophy in the world. The new Marxist philosophy of man was a philosophical reaction against the Stalinist-inspired orthodoxy and at the same time the theoretical expression and foundation for the struggle. Without it, the same struggle going on in the arts would have been less self-conscious and would have reacted against the confining strictures of socialist realism without, in fact, having a clearly formulated idea of why or in whose name it was carrying on this struggle. In the last instance, both the struggle in philosophy and in the arts were against the narrow conception that their role was to be socially edifying, and by extension against a certain understanding of the nature of reality held by the proponents of orthodoxy. In both philosophy and the arts, a new vision of reality was emerging, one diametrically opposed to that which had been prevalent up to that time. It fell to philosophy to give voice to this vision. The orthodoxy, Marxism-Leninism, stressed that man was conditioned, indeed determined, by the social and historical forces arising from the mode of production and the production relations. Quote, "Man is an ensemble of social relations," end quote, was the famous saying by Marx. In this view, only the working class, because of its historical position in the declining capitalist system, had the possibility of being the agent of real change. But even this possibility was as much a result of the, quote, "objective forces," end quote, at work as it was of any conscious effort. Hence Lenin's view that it was up to the vanguard of the working class to act in the name of the workers in order to effect change. But this too sprang from a perception of necessity, of an understanding of the historical and social forces at work. The vanguard of the working class, the Communist Party, thus became the interpreter of historical necessity for the working class and for society at large. Under Stalin, this became fixed and reduced to a set of formulas with a rigid set of historical conditions determining the nature of society and social relations, and the party acting only as the agent of this process in interpreting it to the people. In the end, the whole conception was reduced to a legitimation of the party's activities, whatever they were, and in this sense served merely as a legitimizing ideology for power. The individual had no part to play in all of this, for the individual was seen as an outcome of the quote objective social relations over which he or she had no control. In epistemology, this had its corollary in Lenin's concept of quote reflection, where there is a quote objective reality, and man's task is to mirror that objective reality in his understanding as closely as possible and to act on this basis. Footnote. See Lenin, Materialism and Empirical Criticism. Quote, matter is a philosophical category designating the objective reality which is given to man by man's sensations and which is copied, photographed, and reflected by our sensations while existing independently of them. End quote. Lenin. The practical outcome of this philosophy was that the party had the central position in the society and had all the power in its hands. If it was seen as the only true interpreter of historical necessity, and it most clearly reflected the quote objective world in its views, that its position in society followed logically from these assumptions, just as logically followed the concept that all other facets of society should work together toward facilitating the party's position and task. This is especially important for the arts and for philosophy, because the role they played in influencing attitudes and forming the consciousness of the masses was more direct than that of other facets of society, though the task of raising consciousness to the perception of historical necessity was shared by all. It was from this way of conceiving reality, and by inference, the party's role in society, that the whole concept of the socially edifying role of the arts and philosophy arose. Again, this perception of reality, philosophy, and the arts were waging their struggle. Kozak wrote in an essay on Hegel that philosophy is no longer philosophy if it refuses to investigate reality in its full breadth, in all its internal interconnections, gives up its revolutionary critical nature in favor of apologetics, thinking that it is thereby defending socialism and serving the party, or views development from the perspective of the given moment and giving need. Thinking that it is thereby defending socialism and serving the party, or views development from the perspective of the given moment and a given need only, instead of examining it dialectically in terms of overall development and the contradictions inherent in any given historical situation. According to Kozak, philosophy during the time of the personality cult, quote, personality cult, was predicated on, quote, revealed truth, end quote. Instead of basing itself on arguments to be verified, it based itself on, quote, revealed truth to be believed. Philosophy must investigate reality not as a mere collection of atoms that have nothing to do with one another, but as a, quote, internally differentiated developing whole, end quote. Quote, why did we view socialism before in a one-sided, dried-out way, and now only are coming to conceive of it as a contradictory but rich, concrete, specific reality which grows out of our activity and our work and our creation, end quote. Kozik. The section Art of Philosophy in the book Man and His World by Zvitak reflects the concerns of the philosophical and artistic communities to define the nature of their activity and its place. It constituted an attempt to clear the air for an understanding of what philosophy actually was and to dispel some illusions as to what its role should be. This effort was common to many people in both philosophy and the arts. At this stage, they wanted to obtain some measure of, quote, breathing room, to gain greater flexibility for their endeavors. To accomplish this task, they had to win ground away from the party's, quote, guidance or interference in philosophical and artistic matters. This, however, entailed first and foremost a theoretical clarification, if only for their own sake, of what the role of philosophy or art actually is, that is to say, what it should be. The question of role, in this case, social role, presupposes, however, the more basic question of philosophy or of art. Therefore, Zvitak asked the question, what is philosophy? Zvitak started out by asking whether philosophy in fact existed in the Czechoslovak setting of that time because, according to Zvitak, to ask that question was in keeping with philosophy's task of asking the most fundamental question, the question of existence. By beginning his essay with this question, Zvitak implied several things from the outset. Zvitak implied a certain conception of philosophy. Further, he implied that philosophy, according to this conception, was non-existent in the Czechoslovak social setting. Philosophy, defined here for the sake of simplicity as, quote, love of wisdom, end quote, had become, quote, an aversion to thinking, a system of dogmas based on an emotional bias in favor of socialism, end quote, Ivan Zvitak. At the same time, these pages contain both a mockery and a challenge to the statement that most people had tended to forget that social consciousness was determined by social relationships in the present time as well. What caused the appearance of such a situation in philosophy? This question is answered indirectly in Zvitak's discussion of the leading role of the party, wherein he suggested that the non-existence of philosophy, in the true sense of the word, was an outcome of party interference in matters pertaining to science and art. This situation, however, was brought about in Zvitak's view by a misconception as to what this, quote, leading role entailed. Quote, it was thought, Zvitak writes, quote, that party spirit meant serving the interests of the party. ... We are now abandoning this practice forever and beginning to make room for real theoretical work, laying emphasis on the significance of theory as creative work, as the discovery of the new, end quote. Ivan Zvitak. With this statement, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Zvitak was saying that the party had no right to demand of philosophy something that would mean the negation of philosophy. To be sure, the party could ask that philosophers disseminate and popularize the basic tenets of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, but it erred in making this philosophy's sole function, meanwhile subordinated to the theoretical aspects of philosophy to the rulings of the party, based on party needs. Theory is responsible only to reality, to facts, Zvitak claimed, and not to the party. The battle was joined after this as Zvitak attacked some of the most fundamental assumptions of Marxism-Leninism, as it was then understood, and by extension its very nature. The stress on the creative character of philosophy meant that the philosophy was no longer the final authority. This interpretation went against the party practice of attempting to, quote, direct art and philosophy in the same way it attempted to run the economy by directives. In stressing the creative role of philosophy, Zvitak was consistent with the main thrust of the new understanding of Marxism that was beginning to emerge. At the same time, Ivan Zvitak was attacking the Leninist views of the role of the party as the final arbiter and authority. The party claimed to be in possession of the highest level of consciousness, for which reason it reserved the right to interpret reality. By emphasizing, quote, facts and reality, Zvitak was in effect undermining that claim, as well as referring to the tendency exhibited by the party under Stalin of distorting facts to suit its own purposes. Quote, philosophy, Zvitak stressed, quote, fulfills its social role only if it lights the way when empiricism is left helpless, if it raises basic questions and answers them, if it turns problems into self-evident truths, and if it is capable of looking at self-evident truths as if they were problems, to put it simply, if it thinks, and only if it thinks, never otherwise, end quote. Zvitak, in the book Man and His World, A Marxian View. New section, Praxis. The concept of, quote, praxis, whether explicitly a part of any given work or not, is the key to understanding the whole of Marxist humanism. It is certainly the crucial idea for the struggle that was going on between orthodox Marxism-Leninism and the Communist Party on the one side, and the proponents of the new Marxist philosophy of man and the artist on the other. It is the new way of understanding praxis as man's creative mode of living in the world, as the recognition that reality is a human reality, with man as the subject as well as the object of it. That is so fundamentally different from the Marxist-Leninist view of the world. In this new view, each person takes on significance and can take part in creating his reality, in this case, social reality. This belief radically undermines both the party's claim to be the sole agent for interpreting historical necessity, and the view that art is to assist by helping to educate the, quote, new socialist man, end quote. Art is part of the creative activity of man in creating his world, and philosophy as, quote, critical thinking can never be made into apologetics. Therefore, the very concept of, quote, revolutionary human praxis, end quote, is a revolutionary one, not because of the word revolutionary, but because of the realization that man makes his social reality and can therefore change his social reality. Dialectics is the means of explaining social phenomena on the basis of the practical objective activity of historical man. For Kozik, the, quote, concrete or, quote, concrete totality, end quote, is the key concept of this entire thinking, because it is not a statement about how reality can be known, but a statement about the nature of reality itself. Reality conceived of as, quote, concrete reality is reality in the form of a structured, developing, and self-creating whole, a whole that makes it possible for any arbitrary or chance fact to be comprehended as part of this whole. This is not a given, however. True reality is not evident for all to see, but must be uncovered, sought out. This is the significance of the dialectics. It is dialectically that the distinction between appearances and actual facts is made. Appearances, the world of everyday phenomena that has been taken by most as the quote real world, have to be transcended if the true nature of reality is to be comprehended. The world of appearances is what Kozik calls quote pseudo-concreteness, end quote. And it is the pseudo-concreteness that can be overcome dialectically. Reality does not reveal itself to man directly through things. The nature of reality is at once revealed and hidden by phenomena. Quote, pseudo-concreteness arises when one assumes that the phenomena in and by themselves reveal the nature of reality. Dialectics is the method whereby the phenomenon is separated from the essence. It is critical thinking whereby a, quote, thing in itself, end quote, is arrived at by getting beyond appearances to the reality within. This process in thinking, in knowing, means, however, that for man to know a, quote, thing in itself, end quote, he must transform it into a, quote, thing for himself, end quote. This goes back to a prior question, quote, how is reality created, end quote, and shows immediately the fundamental difference from Lenin's epistemology. Kozik goes further, however, and carries this idea beyond the epistemological category by stating that this is also the nature of reality. It is through praxis that we arrive at reality, because this means that we perceive reality as our product. This is not an idealist conception. The world of reality is not created by the mind. Rather, it is necessary to realize that man's products and social relations were all created by man. Nature can be changed and transformed, but social reality can be changed in a revolutionary way because it is a product of man. In neither case is anything meaningful for man unless he makes it a, quote, thing for himself, end quote. It is in this context that the destruction of pseudo-concreteness means revolutionary human praxis, which is the same thing as the, quote, humanization of man, critical dialectical thought that goes beyond appearances to the, quote, thing in itself, end quote. This entails the, quote, realization of truth and the creation of reality, as every individual has a part in the creation of this truth as a socio-historical being, end quote. Kozik. Dialectic of concrete. Kozik takes issue with this existentialist stance, criticizing it for its lack of social dimension. This is important for an understanding of praxis. Though praxis is also the individual's creative activity, it is not only the individual that is concerned. Man, and thus also each individual, creates his world by creating the forms and social relations of which he is a part. Each individual alone, quote, does not change the world, but only a stance toward the world. Existential modification is not the revolutionary transformation of the world, but the individual drama of the individual in the world. End quote. Kozik. There is a subtle but crucial difference between the individual acting in the social context through praxis to change his world and the existentialist position toward the world of which he is a part. Kozik is careful to differentiate between fetishized false praxis and the authentic meaning of this concept. He speaks of fetishized praxis as an outcome of the desacralization of nature. And of the desacralization of man, where nature is conceived as a, quote, object for exploitation and a, quote, conglomerate of mechanical forces, end quote, and man in turn becomes a being that can be, quote, shaped and formed, or in other words, manipulated. Machiavelli was the theoretician for the modern era, according to Kozik, because Machiavelli recognized this trend and described it. Authentic praxis, in contrast, is the answer to the question, quote, who is man, quote, what is human social reality, and, quote, how is that reality produced? Quote, praxis is the sphere of the human being. Praxis is the sphere of the human being, end quote. As such, praxis is in opposition to Aristotelian tradition, and thus implicitly in opposition to Leninism. 」 . 」 . 」 . Footnote. Kolakowski's interpretation of the Aristotelian position is unique and interesting, and it would tend to resemble Kozik's own understanding as it is implicit in his work. End footnote. Kozik adds a further dimension when he says, quote, praxis is one further dimension. In its events, in which a specifically human reality is produced, a reality which exists independently of man is simultaneously taking place in a certain way. Man's openness to nature altogether is produced in praxis. In the, quote, onto-creative, end quote, process of human praxis, ontological possibilities are found, that is, possibilities of understanding of being itself. The creation of human social reality is a prerequisite for an openness to an understanding of reality altogether. Praxis, as the production of human reality, is simultaneously a process in which the universe and reality in its own existence are discovered. End quote. Kozik. Kozik stresses that although man creates his world, this is not all there is to reality. Quote, reality is not authentic reality without man, in the same way that it is not only man's reality. It is the reality of nature as an absolute totality, which is independent not only of man's consciousness, but also of his very existence, and it is the reality of man, which, in nature and as an integral part of nature, makes human social reality. This reality goes beyond nature and defines for itself in history its own position in the universe. Man does not live in two spheres, nor does he inhabit history with part of his being in nature with another. As man, he is always at one and the same time in both nature and in history. As man, he is always at one and the same time in both nature and history. End quote. Kozik. Zvitak uses the concepts, quote, critical thinking and, quote, laws of development, or, quote, laws of evolution of society, where the former means an understanding of the latter and harmony with them. At first glance, this usage might appear to negate the possibility of any real transformation of society and to undermine the entire concept of praxis as man's creative activity in changing his world. This seeming contradiction, however, can be explained. Although Zvitak uses some of the old terminology borrowed from the deterministic approach to social reality, in actuality something quite different is concealed behind the idea of, quote, law of development, end quote. Critical thinking, dialectics, does not mean recognizing and conforming to necessity as in the deterministic outlook. Rather, it means the perception of the nature of reality and the concrete totality of man and his world. Zvitak, in turn, is concerned with showing in an essay on Camus that socialist humanism represents a more complete understanding of man than does existentialism. His treatment of Camus seems lacking in depth. Some of the points he criticizes seem to be dealt with too facilely at times. The lack of depth may be traceable to the date of writing. Alternatively, it may also stem from a characteristic of Zvitak's thought. His insight, though very penetrating at times, sometimes tends to view all other modes of thinking exclusively in terms of the compatibility with or similarity to socialist humanism. The problem of pseudo-concreteness and the world of appearances is analyzed by Kozik in another way through the concept of, quote, care. Although the concept was originally Heidegger's, Kozik adapted it to his own use. For Kozik, quote, care means the way in which the individual is woven into a network of relations that, in relation to man, appear in the form of the practical utilitarian world. Care refers to the world of, quote, given, with which the individual has to deal, with the world of social relations, which is the natural world to the individual. It is not recognized as being a, quote, fetishized world, wherein the popular mind, which Kozik equates with philosophical ideology, The network of social relations seems to be a world of finished, ready-made operati, arrangements, relations, etc. These Kozik calls, quote, procuring, and they are fetishized because the individual does not realize that they have been created by him, by man, and not something fixed in relation to him. He moves about in the world, conscious of himself as subject, not as subject in the true sense. Man is the creator of his social relations, but only as a subject who is, quote, involved in this network of social relations and activity without being aware of the true nature of these ties. Another aspect of this outlook is man's relation to nature, because this this mode of living in the social sphere implies a specific approach to nature as well. Nature is viewed as a laboratory and as a source of raw materials, and man's relation to nature is one of conqueror and creator, in one sense, of the material for production. The consequence of viewing nature in this way is that man's life is made much poorer. This attitude toward nature cuts off the aesthetic side of man's existence at its root. Even more important, with the loss of the view of nature as something that was not created by man or by anyone else, man loses the awareness that he himself is part of a great whole, by comparison with which he becomes aware of his own smallness and of his own greatness. Furthermore, in the world of care, man loses sight of his own true temporality. He is constantly thinking only in terms of the future and thus devalues the present. He does not evaluate the present in terms both of his future goals, plans, etc., and of his past. He does not live in the present, but rather is constantly in transition through the present, with eyes only for the future. It is significant that, although Kozik later writes about this topic explicitly in terms of capitalism, here he is writing in general terms only. At no point does he even suggest that the world of care is only a capitalist phenomenon. Although Kozik does not apply this world directly to socialism either, it is clear that he considers it a problem of the modern age, regardless of the kind of economic system operative. This is why his analysis could be applied to the specific Czechoslovak situation. Furthermore, the reference to the, quote, philosophical ideology, unquote, could be understood to pertain to that context as well, particularly when one understands, quote, ideology in the Marxian sense of fetishized views of the world, ways of explaining one's own activities apologetically, and then taking this explanation to be the truth, forgetting its origins. New section, ideology. Traditionally, in Soviet Marxism, quote, ideology has been used exclusively with reference to the bourgeoisie, meaning in essence, quote, bourgeois ideology. Gradually, the meaning of the term changed in Soviet usage and it took on a more general connotation. At this point, quote, class ideology became a popular concept, the idea that ideology was bad only when it lacked the proper class base, i.e., anywhere except under socialism. By linking the fetishization in everyday consciousness, quote, procuring, with philosophical ideology, Kozik was cutting through this subterfuge and restoring something of the original Marxian content to the understanding of the term ideology. This distinction played a very important role in Czechoslovakia at that time because it clarified the struggle then going on within philosophy. Sorry, I fucked that up. In doing so, he also drew the distinction between true philosophy and ideology. Kozik used the term philosophical ideology rather than just ideology. This distinction played a very important role in Czechoslovakia at that time because it clarified the struggle then going on within philosophy between those adhering to the, quote, new way of thinking and those continuing to defend the orthodox Marxist-Leninist position. Kozik differentiates between ideology and theory defining ideology as the way of thinking that views, quote, categories, ideas, concepts as something independent, self-sufficient, and absolute, end quote. In contrast to the view that sees them as, quote, a, quote, theoretical expression of reality, as they express the, quote, forms of being, the conditions of existence, end quote, of reality itself, end quote. Kozik sees three distinct and historically separate definitions of ideology at work, yet notes that there is a tendency for them to become confused. Marx in the beginning and Engels throughout his life used the term to mean, quote, false consciousness, in the sense of a, quote, upside-down, illusory conception of reality, end quote. Lenin used it to indicate that ideology was a, quote, a reflection of class conditions in the minds of people, end quote. And Stalin, in his short course, quote, talked about the ideological and theoretical principles of the party as if he were talking about two separate matters, end quote. Kozik. The distinctions Kozik points out in the meaning of ideology are very important for an understanding of the way the term was used in Czechoslovakia during the period in question. Kozik himself favors the first definition, false consciousness at least by usage. He speaks of Marxism as the philosophical expression of the ideas of the working class, but he never refers to this as ideology and always carefully indicates that, although Marxism may encompass this element, it is not only the reflection of working class ideas of conditions. In fact, although one could assume from Kozik's presentation in Dialectics of the Concrete that, quote, fetishized praxis is merely an outcome of class conditions, which is in a sense true, Kozik goes much deeper in his analysis. Kozik goes beyond classes per se to what lies beyond the class struggle or the existence of classes. Because of his interest in going beyond them as phenomena, he really even treats the whole matter of classes and the class struggle rather matter-of-factly. Here again he implicitly departs from Lenin. Kozik's understanding and mention of ideology as false consciousness was prophetic. However, he himself differentiates between philosophers who stay on the surface of matters and deal only with subjectivism, and those who attempt to go deeper by way of dialectics to an understanding of problems. Another facet of the discussion of theory and ideology that Kozik brings out is the subject of reason. Kozik examines the nature of reason and criticizes the common assumption that views reason only as the, quote, independent reason of the Cartesian man, end quote. This reason is criticized because it in fact is not independent but depends on the, quote, reason of society, which is greater than the reason of Cartesian man. In this view, then, the, quote, transcendental reason of the society takes the form of transcendental, quote, regularities, which man fails to see as springing from the social activity of human beings. Quote, reason and science thus concern themselves only with learning to know these, quote, regularities, and in the name of freedom as, quote, recognition of necessity, and, quote, submitting themselves to them. Although Kozik here again is writing of modern capitalist society, certain aspects of his description would seem to apply also to the situation pertaining in the socialist societies. It seems particularly applicable to societies in which Stalin's legacy was still fairly strong, as in Czechoslovakia, but in some ways it would apply to any Marxist-Leninist society. Reason is not, according to Kozik, the, quote, recognition of necessity, end quote, historical, social, or otherwise. It was in the name of historical necessity that the Communist Party claimed its legitimacy and role as leader, vanguard of the working class, and by extension, of all of society. In contrast, Kozik goes on to elaborate on what reason is or should be. Quote, reason is the reason of an individual, But the reasonableness of his reason is not that it is without presuppositions, but that it includes reasonable premises as the premises of its own reasonableness. Includes reasonable premises as the premises of its own reasonableness. Therefore, there is no direct evidence of Cartesian reason. Reason is communicated by rationally apportioned and rationally created social reality. End quote. The central theme of the new understanding of philosophy is once again revealed in this passage. Quote, reasonableness as such rests ultimately on the rational, quote, reasonable creation of reality, which is the task Kozik ascribes to dialectical reason, i.e. praxis. This goes back also to an earlier discussion of epistemology and to the claim that dialectical reason, or, quote, critical thinking, as it was called there, is not merely an epistemological method. It is also an ontological method, a statement not about knowing reality, but also about the nature of reality. As such, it is also the answer, or part of the answer to the question, quote, how is reality created, end quote. Quote, rationalist reasoning, quote, examined in more detail, is seen to give birth to irrationality because it creates realities that it can neither understand nor control, neither rationally explain and comprehend nor rationally order, because it starts from the wrong premises. It takes itself for granted, and it cannot therefore encompass, either practically or theoretically, the world as a whole. Kozik here draws a distinction between, quote, rational and what he terms, quote, efficient, and where, quote, efficient denotes behavior. Kozik here draws a distinction between, quote, rational and what he terms, quote, efficient, where, quote, efficient denotes utilitarian behavior. One second. Quote, rational would then refer to the true state of reasonableness, whereas, quote, efficient is seen only in the aberration of this reason. Reason is then merely technique in this understanding and encompasses the technical side of life, or that which can be reached technically. Human values and meanings are left to the domain of the irrational as a logical outcome of this understanding of reason. Quote, dialectical reason, on the other hand, is characterized by the fact that it, quote, does not exist outside of reality and does not leave reality out either. It exists only by virtue of the fact that it realized, actualized, its own reasonableness, i.e. it creates itself in the form of dialectical reason only insofar as in the historical process it creates a reasonable reality, end quote. Kozik applied his analysis of reason to the concrete social situation in a speech he gave at the Fourth Congress of the Czechoslovak Writers in June 1967. It was a short speech entitled Reason and Conscience and took its inspiration from Jan Hus. It is noteworthy from the point of view of Kozik's philosophy in that it implicitly repeats his idea of the, quote, reasonableness of reason, end quote, continuing the distinction between, quote, false reason and, quote, true reason, and applying that distinction explicitly to the Czechoslovak situation. Zvitek also deals with the question of ideology in a manner similar to Kozik's. The issue was an extension of the basic struggle with the party and the struggle to arrive at a workable definition of philosophy and art. For Svitak, it was a question of, quote, direct contact with the deepest needs of our life, or the death of thought, that is, the alternative facing creation in science and art, end quote. Ideology is a consequence of ignoring dialectics. In Svitak's view, thinking dialectically means to be aware of contradictions, specifically in this context, the internal contradictions within society. Several features are characteristic of ideology. First, ignoring dialectics means that ideas become fixed and concepts become absolute, because an unchanging, quote, truth is an issue, not an ongoing process. The second result of ignoring dialectical thinking is that conflicts within society are also ignored. Only a bright picture is painted by the official view. This picture, moreover, is one that then becomes reality for those within this framework. How does one know whether it is a reality, or only one's perception of reality that is at issue? Whereas Kozik formulates the issue philosophically, theoretically Svitak makes it a direct confrontation. Quote, theoretician, artist, do you intend to embellish the existing conditions with the ornament of your abstractions, and give theory or art an appearance of depth at variance with the truth? Or do you intend to make your thinking an instrument for the reshaping of these conditions? End quote. Svitak, Man in His World. New section. Quote, everydayness, end quote. Kozik uses yet another concept with which to characterize the world of appearances, that of, quote, everydayness, end quote. Everydayness is similar to pseudo-concreteness and to the fetishized world. It is the instinctive, subconscious, and unconscious, unreflective mechanism of acting and living. Things, people, movements, tasks, the surroundings are not perceived in their originality and authenticity. They are not examined and do not appear. They merely are, and they are seen as an inventory, an integral part of the, quote, I don't know why I said that quote. There's no quote. They merely are, and they are seen as an inventory, an integral part of the familiar world. An integral part of the familiar world. Everydayness is the phenomenological world, a world in which reality both reveals itself and hides itself at the same time and in a specific way. The individual creates relations on the basis of his own experience, possibilities, and activity. He therefore regards this reality as his very own world. This view is disturbed only when in some way the everydayness is shaken, at which time the everydayness becomes problematical to him. This introduces the subject of, quote, everydayness and history, end quote. Why are these examined in juxtaposition like this? What is their connection? Quote, everydayness to the average person means the natural atmosphere or familiar reality. Quote, history, on the other hand, is viewed as the transcendental reality going on behind his back and interjecting itself into his everydayness in the form of catastrophes. For the individual, history becomes synonymous with fate when everydayness and history are separated, when it is not recognized that they interpenetrate each other and interact. Everydayness separated from history is emptied to an absurd unchangeability, whereas history torn from everydayness changes into an absurdly powerless colossus that interrupts everydayness like a catastrophe but cannot change it. That is, it cannot separate out its banality and fill it with some content. When this happens, everydayness turns into a, quote, religion of every day, end quote, and loses its historical dimension. It becomes banal and anonymous, and it dictates to every individual's behavior. actions, taste, and even his protest against banality. The quote, religion or everyday awareness of daily life regards human existence as something manipulable, and it behaves with it and explains it on this basis. Kozik asks further why people look for meaning in history. Even though people make history, why does it seem to them that they are mere instruments carrying out some higher purpose? Kozik disputes the idea that some external factor gives meaning to history. History is the struggle for meaning, for, quote, reasonableness against unreason. Quote, man actualizes himself, humanizes himself in history, end quote. Kozik. Kozik goes on to argue that certain qualities such as tragedy, absurdity, etc. may exist within history, but history in itself is none of these. He also talks about history as continuity, as that which enables man to learn from his past. Then in a short, cogent passage, he describes the relation of the individual to history. Quote, the connection of the objectified and materialized praxis of mankind, called, quote, substance, quote, the objective spirit, quote, culture, or, quote, civilization, and deciphered in materialist theory as the critical unity of the forces of production and the conditions of production, produces a historically attainable, quote, reason for society. This, quote, reason is independent of all specific individuals and therefore beyond individuality, but in actuality has its existence only through the activity and reason of individuals. The objective social substance in the form of materialized forces of production, of language and forms of thinking is independent of the will and consciousness of individuals, but exists only through their activity, thinking, and speech, end quote. Kozik. Kozik ties in everydayness by implication to the socialist, quote, reality of which he is a part. He says that the materialist thesis, which holds that man is an ensemble of social conditions, but does not add that he is the subject of these conditions, makes of the, quote, interpretation of something only a choice of whether to put the real subject into the empty space, or to put a mystified subject there, a mystified, quote, ideology, or a mystified, quote, we, for whom the authentic individual is transformed into an instrument or a mask. This is a scarcely veiled attack on what Kozik refers to as, quote, vulgar materialism, meaning the Stalinist legacy in orthodox Marxism-Leninism. Those still operating in terms of this legacy were indeed guilty in their approach to precisely the era that Kozik so roundly condemned, and this must have been immediately apparent to his contemporaries, at least to those who had begun to think on their own about what was transpiring in Czechoslovakia. Whereas man as, quote, care represented pure subjective activity and involvement in the world, man as, quote, homo economicus, end quote, represents the opposite extreme, according to Kozik, the world conceived of only, quote, objectively, wherein man too becomes an object among objects. Quote, the subject abstracts from his subjectivity and becomes an object and an element of the system. Man is a unit which is determined by its function in the system of regularities, regular laws, end quote. This way of viewing man is a result of the rise of science, in this case specifically political economy. This new science wants to transform man into something that can be counted and analyzed, just as any other object of investigation. For the real, for modern science is that which can be expressed mathematically. Political economics sees economy as a system of regularities that man comes to know Only then does it ask what the relation is of man to this system. Quote, Homo economicus is man as an integral part of the system, and as such must be equipped with those basic characteristics which are unavoidable for the movement of this system. End quote. Kozik. Although Kozik here for the first time explicitly mentions capitalism and is critical of capitalism, Kozik is talking of capitalism both in terms of the present and in terms of its place in the rise of the modern world. He asks the question of what kind of man, with what kind of psychic properties the system must make in order to function. This question can be asked of any system, not only of capitalism. Man is changed into a part of the system, into an object. Quote, man's world becomes a physical world, and the science of man becomes the science of man-object, i.e. a social physics. Quote, man's world becomes a physical world, and the science of man becomes the science of man-object, i.e. a social physics, end quote. Kozik. Well, let me copy that down. That's very good. Okay. Man is not seen as being in a specific era, and reality is taken as a once and for all given. Rather than sorry, I fucked that up. Man is not seen as being in a specific era, and reality is taken as a once and for all given, rather than the then state of affairs being recognized as belonging to a specific historical time and place. The alternative is to see that, quote, man always exists within a system, and as an integral part of this system is reduced to certain facets, functions, or forms, one-sided and objectivized of his being. At the same time, he is always greater than this system, and as a person, cannot be reduced to the system. End quote. Quote, the existence of concrete man extends in a span between non-reducibility to the system and the possibility of going beyond the system to the actual placement and practical functioning within the system of historical conditions and relations. End quote. So the two extremes of non-authenticity in the modern age can be characterized by the terms care and homo economicus. In neither of them does man realize that he is behind social relations and social products, regardless of the kind of society he is in. New section, the critical function of art. Sorry for that pause. The critical function of art. New section. To be able to discern the truth about alienated everydayness and to transcend non-authenticity, man must put a certain distance between it and himself, rid it of all familiarity, and apply a certain, quote, force to it. Here Kozik is setting the stage for the first real mention of the role art has to play in the world, and what he says is again a diametrical opposition to the prevailing concept of art as, quote, socialist realism, quote, into what kind of, quote, forced metaphor and likeness must man and his world be transformed for people to see their own real face and recognize their own real world? It seems to us that one of the main principles of modern art, poetry, and theater, graphic arts, and film is the, quote, violence on everyday reality, the destruction of pseudo-concreteness, end quote. Kozik. By coming out with this statement in his philosophy, Kozik was at the same time implicitly making a very strong political statement in the context of his environment. The issues alive at that time find their expression in Kozik's philosophy, even though Kozik's writing is by no means polemical, and the nature of both his work and the task he set for himself are purely philosophical. Kozik would have it understood, though, not as a, quote, dead discipline divorced from reality, but as a living inquiry into the nature of reality and man's place in it. Reality has the characteristic of being both expressed in and hidden by the phenomena of our everyday lives. So in what way do we penetrate to the essence of a thing behind or in its external manifestations? Man can know reality, can penetrate to the essence of things in two ways, through philosophy and through art. Quote, "It is for this reason that art and philosophy have such a specific meaning for man and such a special mission. Art and philosophy are in their functions vitally important, irreplaceable, and nothing can be substituted for them. Rousseau would have said that they are inalienable." End quote. This understanding of art and philosophy is in marked contrast to what is termed here, quote, sociologism, which is the tendency to replace the idea of, quote, social being with, quote, conditions, where the conditions change and the, quote, human subject merely reacts to these changes, as if the subject were merely a collection of mental capacities. In this view, quote, conditions change and unwind, and the human subject goes along parallel with them and photographs them. Man becomes a photograph of conditions, end quote. Kozik. He renders them artistically or scientifically learning to recognize and represent them. Kozik's emphasis is in marked contrast to Lenin's theory of, quote, reflection, and although the difference had been implicit from the very beginning, it was made more or less explicit with this attack on, quote, sociologism. Man perceives the world and makes it his own through this sensual activity, but he, quote, discovers the meaning, bracket sense, and bracket of things by creating a human meaning, bracket making human sense, and bracket for them, end quote. Kozik. Otherwise they are indeed, quote, senseless. Art, like praxis, makes an indelible mark on all human activity. Quote, every work of art has a twofold character and an indivisible unity. It is an expression of reality, but simultaneously produces reality, that reality which does not exist outside of the work of art or before it, but precisely only in the work of art. End quote. Kozik. Kozik argues that reality could not be conceived of only in terms of, quote, economic factors, which led him to once again stress man's creative role and activity in producing his world. This creative activity in the form of praxis was then compared with the role of art, and the nature of a work of art was the subject of inquiry. In fact, art could not be separated from praxis, as if it were a separate category, any more than philosophy can be separated. They are both a part of praxis, as man's creative mode of being in the world, and as such cannot be considered apart from this context. To attempt to do so renders the discussion meaningless, as Kozik shows when he argues against reducing Shakespeare's plays to, quote, nothing more than an artistic reflection of the class struggle in the era of primary accumulation, end quote. Kozik. Why must art convert a thing into something other than itself, merely reflect it in a quote, artistic way? That art did, in fact, do just this was the prevailing attitude in terms of the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy of the day, and Kozik was showing that this attitude expected from art something completely irrelevant. If a work of art has this twofold character in relation to reality, what does this say about reality? What is expected of art? Must the, quote, reality that art at once reflects and makes be that which men assume to be reality? Quote, how does man know, unquote, Kozik asks, quote, whether this reality that man assumes he knows is not in fact only his idea of reality, end quote. Kozik. If this were true, and man's idea of reality were indeed the same as reality itself, the artist's function would be merely to represent and illustrate it. But this is not the case. Quote, a work of art is not a representation of ideas about reality. A work of art, and as art, it represents reality. It represents reality and simultaneously produces reality, the reality of beauty and art, end quote. Kozik. A, quote, economic factor, end quote, is any particular facet of the whole of society which is given undue emphasis and is not seen as part of the whole. It is viewed as if it were independent of the rest of the whole and of man and his activity. In the modern age, this takes on in particular the form of the economy as an independently understood, autonomous phenomenon, but in fact this autonomy is only an apparent one. Instead of being understood as, quote, economic structure, economy is taken to be the one special feature that determines all other factors in the society. The concept of the economy is the, quote, privileged factor, end quote, that determines all other facets of the society, does not take into account the origin of the society, but simply tries to explain society as something, quote, given. In contrast, the true materialist view holds that the, quote, social whole, socioeconomic formation, is created and constituted by the economic structure. The economic structure creates the unit and interdependence of all spheres of social life, end quote. In this statement, the economic structure is conceived to be, quote, the ensemble of social relations which people occupy in production in relation to the means of production, end quote. The analysis and the differentiation between the concepts, quote, economic factor and, quote, economic structure are particularly important for any discussion of the role of art from the materialist perspective. Some who claim to be materialists were also caught in the tendency to explain everything in terms of the economic factor as only one of many aspects of society, yet the one that plays the dominant role. The effect of Kozik's analysis is to refute this view and to widen the approach. This had implications for his own time as well. Because Stalinism had simplified Marxism to just such an understanding of the role of the economy as Kozik described under the term economic factor, everything in society, including art, tended to be explained in terms of this one factor, making the distinction between the two approaches opened the way to a new understanding of art and a new perspective in philosophy. The concept of class struggle is bound up closely with the understanding of the economic structure, but just as, quote, structure became, quote, factor in the common approach, the whole idea of class struggle was also drastically simplified and began to lose its original meaning. Instead of basing a concept of class struggle on the above understanding of the economic structure as the ensemble of social relations occupied in production and in relation to the means of production, and therefore going deeper into the matter, the commonly held approach assumed that the class struggle was the basic reality from which to operate. From this approach came such ideas as the, quote, class character of a work, whether of philosophy or of art. The whole concept of class character played a large role in the orthodox conception of art, and the shift from thinking in terms of economic factors to the understanding of economic structure undermined at the same time the simplistic view of the class struggle and the class character of any activity then prevalent in the socialist societies of Eastern Europe. This action was necessary in order to clear the way for any new understanding of culture and artistic activity. After reiterating the statement that one cannot begin one's analysis with the economy as if it were something that was already the most basic reality, beyond which no inquiry could possibly go, Kozik maintains that to work on this assumption is to make a fetish a thing out of the economy. Any inquiry must penetrate more deeply to man, who makes social reality. Quote, the primary nature of economy is not a result of some higher degree of reality for specific human products, but comes from the central meaning of praxis and work in making a human reality, end quote. Kozik. In the Renaissance, work was perceived as creation, as truly creative activity whose product said something about the character of the artist as well. This ceased to be the case after the rise of capitalism and the advent of the peculiarly capitalistic division of labor because work then ceased to be a creative activity that said something about its creator and instead became devaluing toward man himself. Quote, the authentic world is an objective world of things and objectified human relations, in comparison with which man is the source of errors, subjectivity, uncertainty, and chance, therefore imperfect reality. End quote. Kozik. The economy, in the sense of sense of economic factor, becomes the highest reality for man. This is in contrast to the true understanding of economy as economic structure, the quote basic structure of human objectivization, as the ground plan and outline of human relations, as an elementary level of human objectivization, as the economic base which determines the superstructure. End quote. Kozik. Kozik then turns to an examination of work as an integral part of being, in which man is changed and becomes objective and the objects of his work are transformed from their original natural state and in some way thereby, quote, humanized. It is through this activity that man makes the human world his world, his world. Work is that sphere of man's activity that is carried out under, quote, the pressure of outside necessity, the fulfillment of which makes possible the existence of the individual, end quote. Kozik. The activity that is not done out of necessity, whether natural or social, is not work but, quote, free creation, end quote, whatever area it is in. However, there can be no separation of work and freedom, as Kozik stresses, because work creates the basis for human freedom and free creative activity. The economy, then, is that, quote, sphere of human reality in which the unity of necessity and freedom, animality and humanity is historically produced. A note of end quote. A note of caution should be sounded here. However, with regard to one point, work is conceived of in the philosophical sense, not in the economic sense. For whereas work in the former sense is where the human social reality is produced, it is in the latter sense only the production of a specific historical form of social wealth. In drawing this distinction, Kozik is, by his own admission, following Marx's observations in his Grundrisse. Although the tension between the opposing points of view might not be immediately perceived by the uninformed or casual reader, anyone who was aware of what was going on and who had more knowledge of Marxist philosophy would need no explanation. It is as if the whole preceding section had been leading up to one remark. Quote, Marxism is not a mechanical materialism which would reduce social knowledge, philosophy, and art to, quote, economic conditions, end quote, and whose analytical activity would then depend on discovering the earthly core of spiritual formations. On the contrary, materialist dialectics shows how the historical subject concretely promises relevant ideas and a complete set of forms of knowledge. Knowledge is not reduced to conditions, but the process by which the concrete subject produces and reproduces social reality, and in it is simultaneously produced and reproduced, is brought to the center of attention. Knowledge is not reduced to conditions, but the process by which the concrete subject produces and reproduces social reality, and in it is simultaneously produced and reproduced, is brought to the center of attention. End quote. Kozik. Kozik takes care to differentiate between, quote, conditions and, quote, being, and again through this stresses the fact that man has a central place, that he is not determined only by events external to him. Kozik continues his discussion of the relation between philosophy and economics in Marx's thought, and in so doing he examines the relation between the young Marx and the Marx of Marx's Capital. Kozik begins his discussion of Marx's Capital by asking what it meant for Marx to have begun this work with an analysis of commodities, and to have ended it with an examination of classes. Kozik proceeds to show the dialectical nature of Marxist thought, the way of getting behind appearances to the essence of phenomena. Marx's Capital is also treated as a literary work, and as such is compared to Hegel's Phenomenology of the Mind. Both are characteristic of a specific literary genre, that of Odyssey. Hegel's book, Phenomenology of the Mind, I think it's usually says phenomenology of mind, or phenomenology of spirit. But anyway, Hegel's Phenomenology of the Mind, is an odyssey of the mind, whereas Capital is an odyssey of concrete historical praxis. In this discussion, as in the earlier ones, the organic unity of Marxist thought from the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 through Capital becomes apparent. As a work of art itself, though in the sphere of philosophy, the book Dialectics of the Concrete exhibits precisely the twofold nature Kozik ascribes to an artwork. It reflects reality while at the same time producing a reality found only within this work. It has an internal consistency that reflects the cogency of the analysis for the world it describes and out of which it springs. Because of these two features, Kozik had a profound influence on the struggle going on between the orthodoxy and those trying to break out of old forms in both philosophy and art. Quote, art in the proper sense of the word is simultaneously demystifying and revolutionary, for it leads man out of his ideas and prejudices about reality to reality itself and its truth. End quote. Kozik. Kozik also asks why a work of art not only serves as a witness to its own time, but also manages to transcend it. His answer is that in addition to serving as a witness of a particular era, the work also becomes an essential element of human existence and of a class or nation's existence. It becomes a part of human social reality and becomes meaningful from this interaction between the particular era and the universal human aspects represented in the work of art. This process takes place in every era, as each time must understand for itself the characteristics of being human. This fact is portrayed in the following words, quote, the historical stages in the development of humanity are not empty forms from which life is evaporated because humanity has reached higher forms of development, but rather through man's creative activity, praxis are constantly being integrated into the present. The part concentrated in the present, in the dialectical sense, quote, superseded, creates human nature, that, quote, substance, which includes both objectivity and subjectivity, both material relations and objectivized forces, and the ability to, quote, see the world and explain it through various modes of subjectivity, that is, scientifically, artistically, philosophically, politically, etc. End quote. Kozik. Zvitek was also concerned with the meaning of art, particularly in modern culture. The modern spirit, is increasingly rationalistic and caught up with science and technology. Consequently, there is a tendency to ignore the spiritual and emotional sides of man, to have as an ideal the complete control over feelings and emotions. This would lead to a dull sort of man, a functionary without any vision. Zvitek, while painting this unflattering picture of modern society, also stresses that, quote, at the very core of human life there lies another source of spiritual activity, the power of the imagination, of creative fantasy, the eternal source of art, end quote. Zvitek. Here is the key to understanding the nature and meaning of art. Art, says Zvitek, is therefore intimately connected with the meaning of man. It involves a conception of the world, and therefore of man and his activity in the world, which is man's creativity. Quote, art invariably calls for an explanation of the meaning of man. It is an appeal to a dimension unknown in nature. End quote. Zvitek. By referring to a, quote, dimension unknown in nature, end quote, Zvitak is once again referring to the specific character of man as opposed to other animals, man's culture. Man is formed not only by nature but by culture, by society, and therein lies a clue to his meaning. Man is to a large degree what his culture makes of him, but he is also the creator of culture. Culture involves man's self-perception, and it's particularly through his self-perception that man defines his meaning. This self-perception changes historically, but common to it all at all times is man's attempt to understand himself. Art is one form of this attempt. Zvitak goes on to speak of transformation in culture as a transformation in social consciousness, and thus as a transformation of man's perception of himself. In this, of course, are transformations in man's objective reality as well, for man's self-perception is not something that exists independently of his objective being in the world. According to Zvitak, transformations in social consciousness include 5 basic features. Quote, 1. The transformation of the content of a given culture, that is, the dialectical process which changes culture in its very essence and reflects the contradictions of the age. 2. The transformation of the structure of social consciousness, especially changes in the particular forms of social consciousness and in the relations between these forms. 3. The transformation of the social characteristics of those who produce culture and of those who consume culture, that is, the transformation of the whole cultural aspect of the various social strata and classes. 4. The transformation of the type of man, as determined by the combination of all his social relationships, both those which retain stable and those which change, that is, the overall transformation of the historically transient human type. 5. The transformation of the forms of life and society of modern man's way of life. End quote. Zvitak. The above discussion of the transformation in social consciousness is important background to an understanding of the nature of art. Art is not something that takes place independently of culture and its transformations. It is intimately involved in these transformations. Art both reflects these changes and helps to create them, but art cannot be understood except in relation to culture and its transformation. In a certain sense, art is therefore a form of social consciousness. This feature is one that Zvitak is concerned to stress because he believes it is unrealistic to attempt to view art as a phenomenon that exists suspended in a vacuum, independent of its social context. To stress this feature of art is therefore a necessity, but it does not mean that art is only a social process. This is the other side of the coin, and Zvitak is equally concerned that it be understood. Quote, art participates in the revolutionary transformation of culture as art, through art, and in no other way. End quote. Zvitak. In another context, Zvitak further develops the theme that through art, man sees the different forms of social consciousness, his different perceptions of himself historically, that the meaning of art is precisely to show the meaning of man. Quote, the riddle of Hamlet and the riddle of the Theban Sphinx are one and the same, and their solution is man, not only figuratively and abstractly, but also concretely. Man as a living existence, ... Man is a living riddle, not only to others, but also to himself, precisely because he is capable of changing his own meaning. He knows that life has no external meaning apart from life itself. Modern man is a riddle to himself, and also the solution to the riddle, as Hamlet is, because he, too, knows that either he creates and guarantees his own meaning or he is absurd. End quote. Zvitak. It is the unique contribution of the modern age that human life is viewed in terms of praxis. Art is a part of the transformation of social consciousness, but as art, it also has its own character and undergoes its own transformations independent of those taking place around it. This is to say that art does not merely reflect the changes going on around it, but undergoes change in and of itself. Although these internal changes relate to those in the social context, The relationship is much more subtle and complex than it changes in art, were only a reflection in some sense of general social changes. Hence, both sides of art must be understood if there is to be any understanding of the meaning of art. Art is influenced by its social context, but at the same time is engaged in creating new forms of social consciousness and transforming culture. Sorry, I lost my spot. Where the hell am I? That is why art is revolutionary. The artist, quote, is always shaping the world according to his imagination. He is creating, ... He does not imitate the world, does not reflect it passively, but forms it and reshapes reality, stylizes reality, and deforms reality, end quote. Zvitak. In doing this, the artist is, quote, giving shape to man's hopes, end quote. He is, quote, a symbol of the struggle to give his age a human face, end quote. Zvitak. Thus, for Zvitak, art must be viewed as a way man expresses his perception of himself, and man's perception of himself is also the perception of his activity in the world. These conceptions of the meaning of art and the social role of art are fundamentally different from those expressed in the official Marxist-Leninist view of art that enforce. Art is not a reflection of social processes, as that view would have it. Neither can art be regulated or told that it should serve to illustrate the view of man officially held at any given moment. For this reason, art is revolutionary because art cannot be subjected to the demands of the social system. Man must constantly redefine his own meaning, and this redefinition is open-ended. Therefore, a work of art, though a reflection of its age, is more than that. It is not, quote, the simple representation of our human condition. It is rather a stimulus to man's insight into himself. It is an incentive to a deeper understanding of man as man, end quote. Zvitak. In an essay entitled Man and Poetry, in his work Man and His World, Zvitak developed the theme that art, and thus also poetry, is a statement about man and his meaning, and that this statement changes along with changes in man's social consciousness historically. Quote, the meaning of poetry is the cultivation of human sensibility, perceptiveness, and understanding of the world, end quote. This understanding of the meaning of poetry prepares the ground for a new conception of the social role of poetry, of art, where art is not expected to serve a specific social or educational function, but is involved in the most basic task of humanizing man, of changing his perceptions of himself and his world. Quote, poetry stimulates man's contact with his personality. It adds to his most precious consciousness of himself. It makes him aware that he is a unique, ephemeral being, perceiving a unique ephemeral world, that he is an existence open to the world, end quote. Zvitak. The essay Man and Poetry is a lyrical essay in its own right. Zvitak speaks of poetry as a, quote, vision of the world, end quote. and in so doing, shows the way in which poetry is at once an agent of man's ability to perceive reality and to create his reality. Quote, the poem integrates us into the universe, into the absurdity of being, into the chaos of existence, not through the operations of reason and logic, but immediately and directly by evoking the world of values and deeper levels of meaning. The poem returns us to our place among mankind in an ordered humanity, in an ordered world in the universe. It gives us back our humanity. End quote. Zvitok. Both here and later, where Zvitok speaks of poetry as helping to penetrate to the essence of phenomena through its insight, Zvitok is expressing the perception of art as one of the ways in which man orders the primal chaos into a structured whole and penetrates to reality, to essences, to the, quote, thing in itself, unquote. Also, Zvitok again expresses here the insight that in poetry, in art, man is, quote, torn out of the context of abstractions and portrayed in the actual constellation of the living moment, end quote. Zvitok. In both Kozik and Zvitok, there is the perception that art is violent in a certain way. Art does violence to some conceptions of reality and, quote, forces man to penetrate beyond appearances. Poetry, by its very nature, is radical. Writing poetry is a revolutionary act. In viewing poetry as a human act and looking at its role over the ages, Zvitok goes beyond even the humanist content usually found in his philosophy, and he touches on the mystery of being. Poetry, Zvitok says, quote, cannot surrender its original meaning, which is to make up poetic graphic fables about man, to create myth. ... Poetry reveals to man the secret aspect of human existence itself, and that has been its function in all the myths of the past, end quote. Zvitok. This statement, coming from a Marxist philosopher who had been engaging in polemics against religion, illustrates the extent to which the new conception of man in Marxism constituted a radical departure from the conception by Stalinism, even from that of orthodox Marxism-Leninism. The statement provides a view of the radical character of this new philosophy of man and the creative possibilities for an understanding of culture based on this philosophy, on this conception of man, as it indeed enables man to be open to his creative possibilities. New section, the Prague Spring. In 1968, both Kozik and Zvitok were increasingly caught up in the tempo of political change. Both tried through their writings and other activity to influence the course of events. In the series of articles entitled Our Present Crisis, which appeared in Literarny Listy in the spring of 1968, Kozik was extremely outspoken. It is evident that Kozik's thinking had changed considerably over the 12-year period in question, though his basic themes remained remarkably similar during this time. The practical consequences he drew from this thought became progressively more radical. In speaking of the crisis in Czechoslovak society that spring, Kozik demonstrated this radicalization well. In 1958, he had been quite bold for his time by writing so critically on the subject of classes, but at that time he was still calling for a return to the Leninist norms of, quote, democratic centralism, end quote. Even in his 1958 call for, quote, democratic centralism, end quote, however, Kozik stressed that a, quote, return to Lenin could not mean a return to the pre-Stalinist days in actuality, but that Lenin must be viewed in light of the requirements of the modern age. He saw Marxism as a, quote, philosophy of everyday life and the everyday relations of people, end quote, in addition to being a, quote, theory of historical growth or a strategy of class struggles, end quote. Kozik. Therefore, if socialism did not give meaning to the everyday lives of people and enable them to realize their longings for a full life of feeling, something was wrong. In the article, Our Present Crisis in 1968, Kozik begins by saying that what is at question is a search for meaning in the life of the society, the nation. This is the essence of the Czech question. Kozik writes elsewhere that Pulaski's, Palacky's time, this Czech nation was threatened by a worldwide process of centralization, but that now it is threatened instead by a system of universal manipulation. Indeed, the characteristic feature of politics in the modern world, according to Kozik, is mass manipulation. Quote, politics as mass manipulation is possible only in a system of universal manipulation. End quote. Kozik. In Czechoslovakia, there is a growing danger that the political nation will be, quote, transformed into an indifferent mass, i.e., a mass of residents who have lost the ability and desire to differentiate between truth and falsehood, good and evil, better from worse, in their actions, thinking, and in their lives as a whole. End quote. Kozik. In this search, the opportunity exists for transforming society and replacing old forms with new, but the danger exists also of not effecting this transformation and of merely changing one set of circumstances for another equally bad set. Implicit in this statement is Kozik's central idea, praxis, whereby man is both subject and object of his social conditions, has the capacity to change those conditions in a radical and revolutionary way. Seen in this context, the article becomes a call to action and the practical side of the philosophical concept of praxis. In his philosophy, Kozik has said that man is capable of transforming his society through revolutionary praxis. In his article, he was calling on people to actually put this theory into, quote, practice. Kozik again attacked the, quote, leading role of the party, and, quote, as practiced and understood at that time, quote, politicians talk of, quote, the leading role of the party, end quote, Kozik wrote, quote, by which they mean, the ruling position of a power group, end quote, Kozik. These remarks signify a radical departure from Lenin's conception of the, quote, leading role of the party, end quote. Although the argument could be made that in fact Kozik was calling only for a return to, quote, democratic centralism, Kozik's article leads one to question that assumption. Kozik talks about both the, quote, party masses and the, quote, non-party masses being manipulated by the, quote, power group. And Kozik proposes that, quote, instead of the old obsolete alliance of party and non-party members, a new political alliance of communists, socialists, Democrats, and other citizens might be created. Socialist democracy is either an all-inclusive democracy or it is not democracy at all, end quote. Kozik. This proposition is something far more than, quote, democratic centralism, even if the party had been viewed as having a, quote, guiding function, as some had suggested. Lenin had definite ideas about the role of the party as the, quote, vanguard of the proletariat, a role that furthermore was necessitated by the political situation under the Tsar, where an elite party of revolutionaries was absolutely essential to the success of the revolution, and a mass party was an impossibility. Also inherent in the call for a new alliance, a new, quote, socialist democracy, end quote, was the basic theme of man's creative activity as the subject of his social conditions, as well as their subject, and therefore the necessity for social conditions that would allow man to be creative, hence an end to party interference in philosophy and art, and an end to the theory that their function was to serve the party in its role as edifier of the masses. Quote, edification became here, quote, mystification, the creation of a false consciousness. But according to the philosophy formulated by Kozik, it was precisely the nature of art and philosophy to demystify, to cut through appearances to the essence of phenomenon. This held true for any society, not only the Czechoslovak one, but it grew out of the specific conditions pertaining in that society at that time, and while transcending this rule, constituted an attempt to explain the developments in that society philosophically. In an interview he had with Antonin Liam, Kozik himself summed up much of the discussion about the importance of the new philosophy. Many themes that found expression in Kozik's writings were mentioned in the course of the interview. In talking about Czechoslovak culture during the period from 1956 to 1968, Kozik had the following to say, quote, there is another question which intrigues me, namely why our culture proved so effective, so vital. There was a definite cross-fertilization between literature, art, and philosophy, so that we can truly speak of a culture in the broadest sense of the word. ... There was a particular cultural, quote, common denominator, end quote, which emerged during the last few years and which manifested itself especially clearly in our cinema. ... The fundamental reality of Czech culture hinged on the question, what is man? That is the political, critical, revolutionary essence. ... The real fundamental polemic of our culture lay in the fact that against the official, one might say, quote, reigning concept of man, it put forth an entirely different concept of its own. End quote. Kozik. Kozik goes on to explain what he means by, quote, official concept of man. Rather than some explicit doctrine, is a concept of man implicit in the regime's political, economic, and moral functioning. One which was at the same time mass-produced by the regime because it required precisely this sort of human being. Oh, shit, this is a quote. Quote. Sorry, let me repeat this, not a quote. Sorry. Just listen. Rather than some explicit doctrine, it is, quote, a concept of man implicit in the regime's political, economic, and moral functioning, one which was at the same time mass-produced by the regime because it required precisely this sort of human being, ... In dealing with the question, quote, what is man, culture naturally formulated its answer quite differently. While the official view saw human characteristics in terms of man's limits, emptiness, simplicity, and lack of dynamism, Czech culture emphasized man as a complex creature, continually alive, elastic, striving to overcome conflicts, a being irreducible to a single dimension. End quote. Kozik. Further on, Kozik gave his assessment of Stalinism and put forward the contention that it was not, in fact, some distortion of socialism, but a, quote, full realization of an entirely different conception of socialism. End quote. Kozik. This conception rested on a fundamentally different view of man. Stalinism is characterized as follows, quote, the concept of history as necessity unfolding with the inevitability of natural scientific law, the self-justification of socialism as both necessary and inevitable, the conception of man as homo economicus or a manipulable unit, the reduction of dialectics to a few elementary features, the perception of truth as a utilitarian tool. The sum of these ideological presuppositions shows us the source from which the well-known Stalinist period originated. End quote. Kozik. Kozik saw philosophy as needing to clarify some of its most fundamental questions. And he saw the significance of the, quote, Prague Spring and the whole era leading up to it as challenging those involved to a thoroughgoing re-examination of some of its underlying assumptions, both philosophical and in terms of the, quote, social, political, and economic functioning of socialism, that is, of the socialist working model. End quote. Kozik. This is the task Kozik set himself and one he fulfilled to an extraordinary degree in the book Dialectics of the Concrete. In his interview, Kozik was calling for exactly that, a systematic reformulation of the most fundamental philosophical assumptions of socialism, based on a radically new view of man and his world. Kozik's other work is important in helping him to clarify his ideas and as a means of making them widespread in the society, a task he also viewed as essential and without which he considered philosophy useless. This view is in character with a call for a, quote, socialist democracy, end quote, and both through his philosophy and his attempts to disseminate this new understanding, Kozik was actively engaged in attempting to create a new society as well. It is out of these attempts that his far-reaching influence on the return of culture after Stalinism becomes, as well as his fundamental significance as the philosopher of this rebirth. If the phoenix was rising from its ashes, this was due at least in part to Karl Kozik. Zvitak was instrumental in interpreting the new philosophy of man for the cultural context, and in a sense, Zvitak served as a bridge between the systematic thinking of Kozik and the realm of art and culture. It was not the case, however, that Zvitak was solely an interpreter for Kozik. In fact, as has been stressed, the thought of both men sprang from a common source, the new conception of man that was then emerging in East European Marxist philosophy. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 3. Yes, Chapter 3 of Varieties of Marxist Humanism, Philosophical Revision in Postwar Eastern Europe by James H. Satterwhite. Thank you so much for listening.